I was unfaithful to my husband unintentionally. I thought I could control myself, but I only managed to destroy my life. My name is Claudia, I'm 32 years old, and recently I lost everything that once made me happy. My life was almost perfect. I had a marriage with Javier, the man I believed would be my partner for life. I never imagined I would be the one to ruin everything. I met Javier when I was 25. I was a freelance graphic designer, a dreamer, full of energy. Javier, on the other hand, was a calmer and more focused man, a civil engineer passionate about his work. We met in a cafe when he accidentally spilled his drink on my laptop. Far from getting angry, we ended up laughing about the incident. That same afternoon, he invited me to dinner, and the rest is history. Our romance progressed quickly. Javier made me feel special, listened to, and above all loved. After 2 years of dating, he proposed to me during a beach getaway. It was a magical moment. The sun setting on the horizon, the warm sand beneath our feet, and his words full of love and promises. We married a year later. It was a simple ceremony but full of meaning. Javier and I had such a strong connection that it seemed indestructible. But as I would later discover, even the strongest relationships can falter. The first year of marriage was wonderful. We shared everything. Our goals, our fears, and even our movie nights at home. Although we both had demanding jobs, we always found time to dedicate to each other. However, as often happens, routine began to slowly set in. There were no more surprises, the spontaneous outings disappeared, and the long nighttime conversations were replaced by the accumulated tiredness of our workdays. First, I didn't give it much importance. I thought it was normal that all couples go through stages of monotony. What I didn't realize at that moment was that this monotony would be fertile ground for my insecurities and impulsive decisions. Alejandro was a new colleague at my work. He was a designer like me, but he had a charisma that made him stand out. He was the typical man who knew how to make you laugh, how to find something interesting in any conversation, and above all, how to make you feel valued. When Alejandro arrived at the office, at first I saw him as just another colleague. But over time his jokes and small compliments began to brighten my days. In those moments when Javier always seemed too busy or tired to pay attention to me, Alejandro offered me something that, without realizing it, I had begun to miss: the feeling of being seen. There was nothing inappropriate between us at first, just casual chats during lunch or a message related to work. But in retrospect, I can see how slowly that relationship was crossing boundaries. At home, things with Javier began to change. He had taken on a major project that kept him late at the office almost every night. Although he said he did it for our future, I felt increasingly alone. I insisted that we needed to spend more time together, but there was always an excuse. A meeting, a deadline, a conference. Claudia, it's not that I don't want to spend time with you, but I can't neglect my work. Don't you see that all this is for us? At that moment, I felt that my words carried no weight for him. Of course, I understood that he worked hard, but I also needed him to make an effort for our relationship. Little by little, our conversations turned into arguments. I reproached him for his emotional absence, and he accused me of not understanding the pressure he was under. That's when I started talking more with Alejandro. His jokes and comments made me forget, at least for a while, the tension I felt in my marriage. With each passing day, Alejandro became a constant in my life, a kind of refuge to which I ran when I felt my world crumbling. At first, they were sporadic conversations in the office during coffee breaks or when we met in the elevator. But slowly, these chats began to extend beyond working hours. Messages at night, phone conversations, and private jokes that only he and I understood. I remember one afternoon in particular. Javier and I had argued that morning about something insignificant, as usually happened lately. His dry and distant tone made me feel invisible all day. At work, my mind was on that fight. Alejandro noticed it right away. "Are you okay, Claudia? You seem down today." "It's nothing," I lied, although the truth was written on my face. "Come on, tell me. Maybe I can help." I don't know exactly what led me to open up to him. Perhaps it was the way he looked at me, as if he really cared. Or maybe it was simply my desperation to feel heard. I told him everything. How Javier and I were increasingly distant, how our conversations seemed mechanical, and how our nights together were just a shadow of what they once were. Alejandro listened attentively, nodding occasionally, and at the end said something that stuck with me. You shouldn't feel this way, Claudia. You're an incredible woman. Someone who deserves to be truly loved. If he can't see it, it's his loss. Those words affected me more than I wanted to admit. I felt flattered, validated, something I hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to be with someone who looked at me the way Alejandro did. At that instant, when I got home that night, Javier was already there, sitting on the sofa with his phone in his hand. He didn't even look up when I came in. I tried to start a conversation, but his answers were monosyllabic, and soon silence filled the room again. I went to bed feeling more alone than ever, while my mind went over and over Alejandro's words. As the weeks passed, my relationship with Alejandro intensified. We sought each other out at the office, as if we needed those little escapes to get through the day. What began as a harmless friendship was beginning to cross lines, although at that time I refused to see it that way. One afternoon, Alejandro invited me out after work. He told me that he knew a small cafe that had just opened near the office, and it would be a good place to relax after such a long day. I hesitated at first, aware that it might seem inappropriate, but then I thought about how Javier probably wouldn't even notice that I was late. So I accepted. The cafe was cozy with dim lighting and soft background music. We sat at a table by the window, and for hours we talked about everything and nothing. Alejandro was charming, funny, and attentive. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. But it was at the end of the evening when something changed. As we were leaving the cafe, he took my arm to help me cross a street full of puddles. It was a simple gesture, but the touch of his hand on my skin made me feel something I shouldn't have felt. I looked at him, and for a moment our eyes met. It was a fraction of a second, but it was enough for both of us to know that something was happening between us. That night at home, while Javier slept beside me, I felt a mix of emotions. Guilt, confusion, but also an excitement that I couldn't ignore. I knew I was playing with fire, but instead of backing away, I found myself getting closer and closer to the edge. The days that followed the cafe were difficult. Alejandro and I met more and more frequently. Although we never openly planned anything, it was as if fate constantly pushed us towards each other. I could feel that what we shared was beginning to overflow, like a dam that could no longer contain the water accumulated behind it. Javier, for his part, remained immersed in his routine. Our conversations were mechanical, and although I tried to recover some of our connection, everything seemed forced. Even when I tried to approach him with small gestures like cooking his favorite dish or suggesting going out together, Javier always had an excuse: work, tiredness, or simply silence. I found myself increasingly alone, seeking in Alejandro what I couldn't find in my marriage. One afternoon at the office, Alejandro sent me a message. "Fancy going out for a drink after work? I need it after this long day." I knew I shouldn't accept. I knew I was playing with fire, but the mere idea of spending time with him filled me with an emotion I hadn't felt in years. My finger moved almost automatically, writing a simple "sure." Where do we meet? We met at a nearby bar. A discreet one that I knew well because I used to go there with colleagues from work. When I arrived, Alejandro was already there waiting for me, with a smile that made my heart race. We sat at a table in the back, away from prying eyes, and began to talk as if we were the only two in the place. At first, everything seemed harmless. Jokes, anecdotes from work, small personal details that we shared to fill the silence. But as the hours passed and the drinks emptied, the atmosphere between us changed. Alejandro leaned slightly towards me, and his voice took on a softer, almost intimate tone. "Claudia, I don't want to sound inappropriate, but I can't stop thinking about you." My hands trembled slightly upon hearing those words. I could feel the heat rising up my neck as I tried to find something to say. "Alex, this isn't right," I murmured. I had openly expressed what I had been trying to ignore for weeks. I knew that at that moment I should get up, leave, and never see him outside of work again. But instead I stayed there, looking into his eyes and feeling my heart pounding. When I realized it, it was too late. Alejandro leaned towards me, and in an impulsive act, we began to let ourselves go. It was a brief kiss, but charged with an intensity one hadn't experienced in years. In that instant, all guilt, fear, and logic vanished. That night I returned home feeling shattered inside. While Javier slept soundly beside me, I couldn't stop reliving that moment with Alejandro. I had crossed a line, and even though I knew I had done wrong, a part of me couldn't completely regret it. The following weeks were an emotional storm. Alejandro and I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but we both knew that everything had changed. Every time we were together, there was a palpable tension between us, a mixture of desire and guilt that we couldn't ignore. Javier began to notice that something wasn't right with me. "You seem distracted lately," he commented one night while we were having dinner. "Is everything okay at work?" "Yes, of course," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "I'm just a little stressed. That's all." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't convinced. And although I tried to be more attentive to him, my thoughts always returned to Alejandro. One afternoon after work, Alejandro asked me to accompany him to his apartment. He had had a difficult day and said he needed to talk to someone. I hesitated, knowing perfectly well what could happen if I accepted, but the temptation was too strong. When we arrived at his apartment, everything was like a dream. Alejandro was so attentive, so affectionate, that he made me feel like the most special woman in the world. Before I knew it, we had crossed a line that had no turning back. That night was a turning point for me. Although I knew what I had done was wrong, I also felt a kind of liberation. But that liberation was ephemeral because the next day, guilt hit me with full force. Javier began to notice my erratic behavior. I was arriving late, avoiding eye contact, and our conversations were increasingly superficial. It wasn't long before he started to suspect. It all began with a silence that felt heavier each day. Javier was becoming more distant, but it wasn't the kind of distance I had noticed before. This time it seemed like he was watching my every move, as if he were looking for something. I was afraid to look him in the eye, fearing that he might read my guilt in them. One night, as we were finishing dinner, Javier stood up from the table with a firm gesture. "Claudia, we need to talk," he said with a seriousness that made me shudder. I froze. I felt that my legs wouldn't respond, that the air in the room was dense. "About what?" I replied, feigning a calmness I was far from feeling. Javier sat down opposite me with his arms crossed. His normally warm eyes were now cold and impenetrable. "I don't know what's going on with you lately, but something's not right. You're distant, evasive, and I can't ignore it anymore. I want to know the truth. Is there someone else?" My heart stopped. I had dreaded this moment since the first day I crossed that line with Alejandro. I could lie, try to save what little remained of our marriage, but something in the way Javier looked at me told me he already knew the answer. "Javier," I murmured, avoiding his gaze. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," he insisted, his voice firm but on the verge of breaking. Tears began to fall down my cheeks. I couldn't keep hiding it. The guilt was a weight that was drowning me. And although I knew that confessing everything would probably destroy our relationship, I also knew that he deserved to know the truth. "There is someone else," I finally admitted, my voice barely a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the sound of my heart pounding as Javier processed what I had just said. His initially incredulous face transformed into a mixture of pain and fury. "Since when?" he asked, his voice cold as ice. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness." I tried to explain, but he didn't want to hear excuses. "Since when, Claudia?" he repeated, this time raising his voice. "It wasn't constant," I replied, sobbing. "It only happened a few times. It never meant anything." "With whom?" The question fell like a bomb. I knew that telling him Alejandro's name would be the final blow, but there was no point in hiding it. "With Alejandro, my coworker," I confessed, feeling smaller and smaller under his gaze. Javier stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. He paced back and forth across the room, running his hands through his hair. "Alejandro, your coworker? The same guy you always said you were just friends with?" "Javier, please let me explain." I tried to approach him, but he raised a hand to stop me. "You have nothing to explain, Claudia. You did it. You betrayed me. And why? Because you felt unsatisfied? Because I couldn't give you the attention you wanted every second of the day? Does that justify destroying our marriage?" His words were like daggers, each one sinking deeper into my heart. I couldn't answer him because I knew he was right. Nothing justified what I had done. "Javier, I love you. I know I made a mistake, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. He let out a bitter laugh, looking at me as if I were a complete stranger. Fix this, Claudia? There's nothing to fix. What you did can't be undone. You destroyed me. Javier couldn't even look me in the eye. The next day when I left our room, I found him in the living room with a cold cup of coffee in front of him, and a lost look that broke my heart. He was sitting on the edge of the sofa, elbows resting on his knees and hands clasped. He seemed to be debating between pain and fury. Javier, I began to speak, but he raised his hand, signaling me to stop. Don't say anything, Claudia. I can't listen to you right now, he said hoarsely, his voice full of weariness. I need to get out of here before I completely lose my temper. I stood there, not knowing how to react. I felt the weight of my mistake tightening my chest like a shackle. Seeing him so destroyed because of me made me feel like the worst person in the world. What does that mean? I asked, trying to hold back the tears. It means I'm leaving, Claudia. I can't stay here. This house suffocates me now because all I see are lies. I need time, I need space, and frankly, I don't know if this can be fixed. Javier, please don't go. We can talk, fix this. I swear I'll do whatever it takes, I said, approaching him. I tried to take his hands, but he pulled away.
No, Claudia.
This isn't about what you'll do, it's about what you've already done, he replied, his eyes filled with restrained tears. I can't look at this house, our photos, our past, and not think about how you destroyed it with your decisions. Javier stood up and began to gather some things in silence. He took a suitcase from the hallway closet and filled it with clothes, a pair of shoes, and some personal items. I watched him from the doorway, feeling completely powerless. Where are you going? I managed to ask, though my voice trembled. I don't know, maybe to my brother's house, maybe to a hotel. It doesn't matter. The only thing is that I can't stay here with you, he replied without looking at me. Before leaving, he stopped at the front door and turned his head just enough so I could see his profile. You know what's the worst part of all this, Claudia? I loved you with all my heart. I always thought we were a team, that we could overcome anything together. But you were the one who decided to break that pact, and that's something I'll never forget. With those words, he opened the door and left, leaving behind an overwhelming emptiness. I stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling my whole world crumble. The days turned into weeks, and each one was more difficult than the last. First, I tried to call him, send him messages. I even wrote him letters that I never dared to deliver. I wanted to explain, to tell him how much I loved him and how sorry I was for what I had done. But he didn't respond to anything. Finally, one day I received an email from his lawyer. It was short and to the point. Javier had initiated divorce proceedings. I felt as if someone had ripped the ground from beneath my feet. I knew I had ruined our marriage, but seeing it so official, so irreversible, destroyed me. The first meeting with his lawyer was cold and professional. Javier wasn't present, which I was partly grateful for, because I wasn't sure I could look him in the eye without breaking down. However, that absence also hurt because it was a sign that he had really closed the door forever. Over the next few weeks, the process progressed. We divided our belongings, sold the house, and each decision was a reminder of what we had lost. I especially remember the day I went to get the last things from the house we had shared. The empty walls, the shelves without books, the corners where there had once been laughter and love were now just shadows of what once was. One afternoon, while going through a box of old photos, I found one from our first vacation together. We were at the beach, smiling under the sun, our hands intertwined. I couldn't hold back the tears. I realized that that moment had been a symbol of everything we had built together, and that now it was nothing more than a painful memory. The day we signed the divorce papers was the final blow. I saw him for the first time since he had left, but he barely looked at me. His face was a mask of indifference, although I could see the pain in his eyes. When I signed my name on the last page, I felt as if I were burying not only our marriage, but also a part of myself. I hope you find what you're looking for, Claudia, he said before leaving, in a tone that was more sad than angry. Life after the divorce was a labyrinth of loneliness and remorse. Every day upon waking, I faced the weight of my decisions. The laughter, the conversations, the moments of shared happiness with Javier were now ghosts that haunted me. I tried to move on. I went to therapy, changed jobs, even tried to make new friends, But nothing could fill the void that Javier had left. I occasionally saw him on social media, always from afar, because I couldn't muster the courage to contact him. He seemed to be rebuilding his life, surrounded by friends and family. He looked happy, and that hurt me as much as it relieved me. Time hasn't erased my regret. I learned the hard way that impulsive decisions can have devastating consequences. That sometimes what we think is a lesson for someone else ends up being a lesson for ourselves. And it's not always easy to learn. Now I live alone with the memories of what I had and what I lost. Javier remains the most important person I've ever had in my life, although now he's just a shadow in my memory. My only hope is that someday I can forgive myself, even though I know he never will.